So we have a lot of questions for all of you. And I will begin with Eric because he began. So Eric, there are a lot of questions about your speech and your fascinating story again. So there are some questions about the role of the family networks in crossing and settlement procedures. I think we can also ask this question for all the speakers of the stations, because the family issue is clearly an issue there. And more than that, Antonin Durand suggested that there is also a gender issues. So maybe you can, all of you, try to elaborate a little bit about the gender issues. And concerning Eric and those refugees, there are also these very well-known figures as Anna Segers or other, the one that who took pictures, fascinating pictures on the boat. So maybe you can also are there these women alone or not? What is the family structure in this among these 5,000 refugees, and so on? That is a first question, maybe for all of you. I don't know if you want me to ask all the questions or that you want to answer first this question and then I go further. It's up to you. Eric, what do you think?
Sure, we can tackle that question, and all three of us can tackle it. I think there's some very interesting connections between papers. All right. In terms of family and gender, I'll try to be specific. Family networks definitely matter. And I noticed one of the questions was also about union connections. So family connections matter because there's dialogue between family members in the New World and in Europe. And for instance, to get an American visa, you had to have at this point 2 guarantors on the United States side. So people were writing to their cousins, writing to their distant family members, and they're actually telegramming each other. And Vichy is very concerned because the telegrams include information on when the boat is due to arrive and so on. So we have real dialogue across the Atlantic there. In terms of union connections, by the way, I have one refugee, a German communist by the name of Lothar Popp, P-O-P-P, who had participated in the Kiel Mutiny of 1918, who gets on one of the boats in Marseille through his contacts with dockers. So he had been in the mutiny in Kiel, he knew dockers in Marseille, so this is a communist union connection. In terms of the women on board, yes, there's some really remarkable female photographers such as Ilse Bing and Germaine Krull. They don't present a single profile. So Bing is there with her husband. Anna Segers, to speak of her, is there with her husband and family. I interviewed their son, Paul Radviani, who remembers having a lot of freedom on board because his parents were so seasick. So there's anecdotes like this. But the contrary example is Germaine Krull, who I believe most testimonies say that she was bisexual. She wasn't on board with any partner. She was there as a single woman. So, you know, there's very different scenarios there. And I would stress that the refugees that I look at, what they have in common is actually that they have a sort of elite status. They're educated enough to have connections, they have enough money to get on board, but beyond that, it's a very diverse set of profiles, politically, religiously, intellectually, politically, you name it. It's a very diverse group. And I was interested when Romy mentioned the politics of these refugees who are deported to Fernando Po. The cleavages, the breaks between the classes are very clear on board the boats.
Yes, I had also some, Antonin has also some questions about this profile, and you begin to answer it about the variety of the profiles, but he has some specific questions about the geographical origins, the proportion of Jews, and I know how it's difficult to answer this question, the proportion of political refugees, and I can add something about this kind of elites, of course, because there are all those well-known figures, as you mentioned, Victor Serre, Anna Segers, Germaine Krull. So how do you what are the main explanations for this kind of selection of refugees on this specific, I mean, of course, there is an elite way of escaping France, but why? Is this a specific elite who is going to Martinique or not?
It's hard to say because there's a methodological problem. And the methodological problem is that I have about 500 thumbnail portraits, so mini portraits, for about 5,000 refugees. So then the question becomes, do I have the 500 because these are intellectuals who kept their correspondence and who are high profile? And then what do we make of the others? So, you know, I know of people on board who didn't leave papers, and some of them are business people, some of them are traders. For the most part, they are of the upper bourgeoisie. So that is something I can determine, because even the ones who didn't leave their papers talk about other people on board being from the bourgeoisie. And so, you know, we have testimonies on board the Paul Le Merle saying that there's these different chapelles, these different groups, these different conclaves, but they're not between working class and elite. They're between left-wing intellectuals, business traders in Antwerp, you know, bohemians. Those are the different groups. So I do think, despite the methodological challenge, that this is people who have the experience to win a duel with the French administration. These are people who are well connected enough to have help from humanitarian organizations. But again, I can never establish a full portrait because I don't have the 4,500 other portraits. One final thing, I don't know the proportion of Jewish people. I mean, you saw that Victor Serge suggested a certain percentage. Well, somebody else on the same boat gave a very different percentage. And I do think I have underrepresented the number of Spaniards on board. So there's one Spanish, Luis Fernandez Clerico, high-ranking Spanish dissident who's on board. I have other names, but in truth, you know, I could only follow so many people into the archives and get so many portraits. So there's a large number of Spanish Republicans. I have some high-profile Italian dissidents like Mario Montagnana, who was actually on the boat when the fascists tried to get him back and asked Vichy to redeport him back to Marseille. So it's a really cosmopolitan group of people, and you could hear many, many different languages on deck.
Okay, and we have also some, thank you, we have also some other questions to you about the end of the story, or not really the end. First, in Martinique, Céline, she wanted to know more about the life in Martinique, their relations with the populations. We saw one slide about the Lazarette camp, but maybe you can elaborate a little more because we have time. And François Héran wanted to know also, after Martinique, eventually, does this allow them to get to the US? How many succeed to go to the US or to other countries? What happened to them finally?
Great question. So the last part of my book is about what happens in Martinique, and in particular, the surprising synergies, the surprising encounters between Négritude and Surrealisme. So the Surrealists and the Négritude movement, and this encounter takes place around the journal Tropique. So this story is somewhat known, but I hope to have developed it further. The large contours of the story in Martinique are the following. The refugees who have French passports are allowed to stay in town in a hotel. However, André Breton has a French passport, and the police tells them, we don't trust you, you're dangerous, and you have to go into the Lazare. So there are exceptions, but the broad division is people with French passports have the right to stay in hotels. Everybody else has to go in one of two camps. So there was a camp at the Lazare. I showed you one picture of it. We're fortunate because two refugees brought their cameras, Antonin Pelch and Germaine Krull, and were able to smuggle them in and leave photos. Some of those photos are in Essen in Germany. The others are in Prague in the Czech Republic. So the problem with the camps is that they're relatively small, and that the Vichy authorities on location say that they have a maximum limit of 400. So for this to work, some refugees have to leave in order for more refugees to arrive. So it's a turnstile, it's a rotating door of people coming in and out. So some refugees stay 2 weeks in Martinique. Some stay, the maximum I have is somebody who dies there, who spends 3 years because he never gets out. And this really depends on the organizations that are lobbying for them, the reception in the United States. So the United States says for some of these people, well, they can't really be in danger because they're in Martinique. So do they pose a threat? Do we let them in? So the final outcome is that some go to Brazil, some go to Argentina, some go to Mexico, some go to Haiti, some go to Cuba. So for instance, Wilfredo Lam is himself a Cuban on board these boats and returns to Cuba via Fort-de-France. Some do go to Canada and the US, but it's really, you know, there's all sorts of scenarios. A whole boatload of people is intercepted and taken to Trinidad, where they languish for months because the British want to interview every single person to make sure they're not a Nazi spy. So there's these incredibly different scenarios.
And did you get the sources from the interviews in Trinidad? Because that could be great.
I have summaries and some really ironic things, such as some of the German refugees saying, listen, we all hate the Nazis, that's why we left. If you want to look for Nazi sympathizers on board, talk to the Vichy French. So there's these incredible dialogues around who is a real Nazi on the boats. Anyway, yes, we have the summaries of those interviews. And so some of the ones, Joseph Breitenbach, for instance, a German Jewish photographer, ends up on that boat, spends time in Trinidad, and finally finds his way to New York. Some of these people have lawyers in the US, some of them don't. Some of them don't want to go to the US. Some of the communists want to go to Mexico all along. So there's very different ambitions and outcomes. But very few stay in Martinique more than 3 months. The vast majority, and that's why this story isn't well known or wasn't well known in Martinique, because, you know, there is a much older Jewish story in Martinique, obviously, but this is a new set of arrivals, and it's very short-lived. I don't want to monopolize all the discussion.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Maybe we could first open the Q&A part to Céline and Romy, and then come back to a general question, because there were also one general question about these historical migrations and the dialogue with present migration and to better understand conventions, refugee conventions and everything. But we will see this part later. And first, maybe for Céline. So I have maybe you can answer the gender questions. The woman, can you see some women among indentured workers? That is the first question. And then I had maybe a questions about slave traders, because I know that in 1848, the main motive of nationality deprivation, I mean the first nationality deprivation in France was for the owners of slaves. So in 1848, the same decree that abolished slavery punished those who continued to possess, buy, or sell slaves with loss of the quality of French citizen. So I'm very interested with those men. Do you have something to tell us about those who continue to sell slaves and doing this trade?
Okay. Thank you. About the gender issue, it's a very important question in my work, and the proportion of women was specified in the contract between the recruiter and the French government, and the proportion was between 20 and 30% of the whole contingent. But in the fact that I said in my presentation, you have two moments currents in the African immigration. In the first moment of African immigration from 1854 to 1856, when French recruited among the free status African, you have the woman were 2% of this recruitment. It's very, very low because the recruiter had a lot of difficulties to recruit free African to French West Indies, and the people agreed to engage with French were crew people from Liberia and Ivory Coast, that they had a culture of temporary work migration with European since 18th century, but it was a men migration. You don't have women and this type of migration. But in the second current of African immigration by repurchased captives, you have the French recruiters recruited 25%. The women were 25% of the whole African indentured laborers by recruited by repurchase. And on the slave market at this moment, you had a lot of children, adolescents, and women. And for Indian immigration, if I remember, the proportion of women was 20% of the whole group. And for I don't know if you see in the last slide, you have a Chinese immigration, very small immigration, and this type of indentured immigration, the women are very rare. It's 2%, like for a free African. And it's the planter and the colonial administration in the French West Indies wanted women because they thought that it's they wanted to found families with women, and I think this result. It's the difficulties about the recruitment. It's not a wish of the planters. And to the question of slave trader, you think slave trader is the French recruiters who made recruitment and you bought, but for the French, they did not say that the slave trader. So they were for him they were in the law, because I did not I don't develop this aspect, but all the discussion, the point of the discussion between Great Britain and French is in the law of the slave trade, and a non decrees or convention defined it precisely what is the slave trade. So the French can say, when you buy a man to liberate them, and they constructed a very interesting speech about the liberty in the French colonies, now that the abolition of slavery, etc., etc. So it's not the slave trade for him. But the French recruiter, because in the fact to buy 1,000 of people, you need to have a skill by people and the market of the slave market in Africa. So it's very interesting because they were not a old slave owner. It's a new, for example, the French recruiter to add the very important contract of 20,000 African. He's a Régis Aîné, and he's a armateur and a very big negociant of Marseille. And he known very well Napoleon III, and he had a big réseau, political and economic réseau, and he worked in Africa since long years in the commerce of huile de palme. He was a man of the new empire, new colonial empire in Africa, but at this moment, the commerce of colonial production and the commerce of human were very linked, and it's not very. And it's a biais of the construction of commerce licit and commerce illicit, but in the fact, you have the same merchants.
Yes, my remark was about, because I know one case of one merchant who was accused of slave trade because he was deprived from his French nationality. So because he was accused of, so but I don't have read a lot about those kind of very small cases of deprivation of nationality because of slave trade, and that could be maybe some avenue that we can.
But I think it's a real slave trader, not a French recruiter of repurchase, but it's a trick to yes, to this. But you have a law in the decrees of 1848 that all French in the world who had a slave could lose his nationality. Yes. But few months after, you have a new law to
postpone.
Yes. Yes, to arrange the situation for the French slave owner in the world.
Okay. Thank you very much, Céline. Romy, maybe you can elaborate also on the gender issue if you wish to. I have also some other questions about the global history of banishment. I mean, if you go a little further, Cuba, what can you say about this global history of banishment? Because it's really a fascinating topic. And I had also a question about the ambiguous role of the exiles in the construction of the national identity. Because what you show, that it's controversial, because I mean, it's not exactly what we learn for years with the Italian case. You know that the Italian immigrants to the States who became Italians during migration, because there were Sicilian and Romanian, and they became Italians with this creation of national identity through migration. And you show some kind of opposite situation. So maybe you can elaborate more about these very interesting topics.
Thanks a lot. So if I may, I may want to answer this last question first, if it's okay. Thanks a lot for asking it. Yeah, because I didn't have time to explain exactly what were the results of such a long dissertation pass, but you just nailed it. I mean, that's exactly what I found. Maybe some of you know the figure of José Martí, which is the I mean, if you went to Cuba, you saw everywhere in the street the figure and the painting of this national hero who liberated Cuba from exile, and who who spent his whole life in exile. But there's, in his case, that is the late 1890s. Well, the national and patriotic narrative is that exile in the US paradoxically gave him the real Cuban identity project, and that he made it out of exile, and then he reunited with the war, and then exile plus war made this essence, Cuban essence. So there's the highly paradoxical place of the US in all that. But that is nationalist narrative, so we want to explore more and not stick with that or stick to that. So I chose to start with José Martí, my research, and the research question was like, hey, there's a country that was made out of exile, but it's really the end of the story. So what I show is that building upon previous waves of exile, and that's a bit of a teleological trick, but that's also history. When you look at the mid-19th century decades, well, you can see that there's more of an ambiguous position of Creoles wanting to be in dialogue with the metropole from exile. They can do lots of things outside the absolutist island. So exile provides possibilities and gives opportunities, but really more to be in discussion with the enemy. So I think it's a very interesting imperial way of saying that you don't just become a nationalist because you go into exile. So I could talk a lot about it, but I'll just leave it there. But thanks for asking about a global history of banishment. Gosh, that's it's really booming right now, and I wish I had read all that I want to read. But I know, for instance, I know that within the Spanish Empire literature, there's lots of recent work, especially on 19th century, long 19th century banishment, especially to North Africa, to Ceuta and Melilla, that I briefly mentioned in the last part of my presentation, and that is still Spain today. So, and that is indeed a place where migrations are really materially happening right now between Europe and Africa. So I think it's interesting also to cross periods of time or time periods to have a better idea. But Spain was sending people in Ceuta and Melilla at the end of the 18th century, during the first anti or independence, during the first independence movement. Even indigenous people from the Andes were in Ceuta imprisoned. So some people are looking at this long story of imperial banishment, and Christian De Vito also published something recently that is very broad. And again, I want to engage in this conversation that is also often a comparative one, which is such a task for historians, but it's happening. So I'm following more than knowing exactly what is in it. And finally, I know why Antonin asked the gender question, and I'm happy he did. So thanks a lot. On gender and family, well, I must say the sources I looked at during all these years, where they just didn't show me women and children. I just didn't found them. So I found them always on the au second plan, so in the background. And what I could build upon that was that they were women when they were part of the New York exile, for example, for the Cuban circles in the 1870s or 1850s. They were assigned to care tasks, sewing flags, which is something that's been seen since forever, since the American-US Revolution, or so sewing flags, so making coffee and making food. So I really want to explore more this, like, what does migration do to the care tasks and the gender lines? And I just want to end up by saying that there's a clear difference between the two periods that I studied. Before the war, before the independence war, I get the feeling that people do not live as a family. And then when war and massive migration happens, then there's a family movement with some sources that indicate that kids are living with their family. But in the first decade, it's more like a man political move that you do with back and forth, with expeditions. But I clearly see that there's a war difference, a pre and after war difference. And I wonder if we could elaborate on what an official war changes to a migration movement that's broader than that. So.
Okay, thank you, Romy. And there is also another question, but that it could be the last part of our discussion part from Mrs. Emma Raolo, and she wants to know what is the current migration situation for Cuba, and is it a territory which is a very important migration destination for other countries? And also there is a new question from Florence Vichiti-Baudou, about the different waves and generations on migrants. So that could introduce the last part of our panel about the relations between our historical fields and current situation. I know it's very hard to handle this kind of issue, and we are not professional of the current situation, but if you can maybe give us, or not, if you don't want to, some things to think the current situation, that would be great. So maybe, Romy, we can begin with yours, because both, and then we will turn.
All right, so I must confess that I hide within 19th century Cuba to avoid post-1959 Cuba questions, but it's part of the job. So I don't want to talk about what I don't know, because that's something that's, you don't do. But what I know is that the current migration situation for Cuba, what I can say is that Cuba is really a place that people have been leaving in great number. And that's been the case in several waves and several modalities since the revolution. But as far as I know, a destination for other countries around, well, not really around. And what's interesting is that current situation in nowadays Cuba is more made of students migration. And I know there's some groups at the ICM that are studying this specific migration. Students migrations, for example, from ancient French countries, les pays amis de Cuba. So that's also a historical thing that we can trace on. So lots of Central African countries are sending students especially to study medicine. And also there's a medical migration to Cuba that's temporary. It's like, it's not really happening now, but people used to go to Cuba to have eye surgery, and that represented, or other types of care, of medical care, and that represented a proper migration. So, or at least some circulation. So that's what I know. But I think people are around in the Caribbean basin. I know that not really so many people want to go to Cuba. So that's what I'm aware of.
Okay. Unfortunately, I was not able to go to Cuba, but I hope I will sometime. Eric and Céline, that is also some questions. There is this question of Mr. Olawale Laval about, do all these historical migrations help us understand how present refugee convention and protocol evolve? That's for Eric, but I think all this question of the law of migrations could be evoked by the two cases, one for the refugee, of course, and the international conventions of 1951 is not so far from World War II. And Céline, maybe also you have something to say about the question of law in your case. So I don't know, maybe Céline, you want to go first, and the last with Eric, that could be good things to end with. The one would be Gan.
Yes. It's a difficult question, the current situation, but about the law, that you can see that all the labor migration are the question of political and diplomatic shame at the general shame, and but on this specific form of work that indenture, that is not the main topic of my presentation today, but it's a type of migration who existed since jusqu'à 20th century. And now you have a form of migration. I think about the Pakistani in Dubai. It's very similar of the indentured labor, and the economic and researcher and historian say that travail contraint, ou that is I don't know in English, but it is not
constraint
labor. And so today you have a lot of forced labor in the world, and the question of the debt, because the cost of travel were paid by the employer. So in the country of arrival, the people were at the beginning in debt of the cost of the travel, and I think it's mechanism that we need to deal now, and we can see a lot of point with the current situation. And in my case, the African immigration, you can see in the French West Indies the interest in prior to have migrant laborers who don't have the socio-linguistic codes of the country at the beginning, and we need to think about what is the interest and the advantage of migrant laborers for a society. And clearly, at this moment, is to perpetuated the socio-economical organization of the ex-slave society, and the indentured laborer need to the purpose was to divide the society with a third group to destroy the demands of the ex-slave. And so I think we can see similarity on a lot of situations today.
Thank you, Céline. Eric, maybe you have something to add and to end this wonderful panel.
Sure. I've been thinking a little bit about these conventions. I mean, this is clearly, my story is part of a massive failure of international conventions, going back to the Evian conference. It speaks to some of the disasters, but also some of the bricolage that's at work. I think in particular of some of the bricolage going on between humanitarian organizations. I found a great deal of correspondence between unexpected quarters, like the Emergency Rescue Committee, the Quakers, HISM, writing back and forth to try to coordinate how to help individual people. So that was very interesting. But in terms of overall international structures, what you see here is a complete failure, because the United States in particular, instead of opening its doors, closes them more and more. And one of the things that I didn't describe is these refugees, like the Itor Khan couple in southern France. They're writing each other back and forth because the doors are being shut in their face. They learn that the Portuguese route has just closed. They learned that, Palestine might not be an option after all because of Rommel's gains in the desert. They learn that the United States is making it harder and harder, and that you suddenly need more and more affidavits to get in. And so rather than making things easier, as the war progresses, the United States is actually making them harder. I discuss in the book how Assistant Secretary of State Breckinridge Long insisted, fearing Nazi infiltration, that people who still had family back in Europe shouldn't be allowed to come, because his fear was that the Nazis would exert torture on the families to make refugees into spies, if that makes any sense to you. So this fear that spies would represent a fifth column is nothing new. Sorry, that refugees would represent a fifth column is nothing new. But the idea that you could make refugees into unwitting spies against their will reaches a new kind of level of paranoia. And so the United States is busy doing due diligence. And actually, the American consul in Martinique, a man of French origin called Marcel Malige, finally gets fed up and says, listen, this is ridiculous. You see spies everywhere. There are no spies on these boats. But the State Department isn't convinced. So it's an utter failure from the standpoint of receiving nations. And of course, this is the sort of last window of opportunity for European refugees. We know what comes next, reading history backwards. So it really is a kind of international tragedy. And the Martinique route only existed because other countries wouldn't open their door to begin with. It was a way of forcing open the door, really. So thanks, everyone. Yeah.
The US closed the door, but Canada did also.
Oh,
There is a wonderful PhD from Annelise Rodrigo about when Canada closed their doors. And it's very fascinating to discover also. I mean, all this North American was almost closed for all the refugees. So
absolutely. It's not just Canada. Argentina's starting to close its doors. Mexico's starting to close its doors after the election in 1941. All the doors are closing. And the last connection, I think, to the present is we saw during the Syrian crisis, all sorts of far-right populist governments saying, well, we don't know, maybe there's terrorists in their ranks. Well, that's the exact parallel with saying, you know, oh, yeah, well, this guy's last name sounds very German. Perhaps he's a Gestapo spy. That same instinct, I think, is a very powerful knee-jerk reaction in times of international crisis. So that problem is still with us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Eric, for those not very optimistic, but realistic. So, and thank you, everyone. And I'm sure that the audience is convinced how history could be important to understand recent and actual issues. So thank you all. You did a great job, and I was very happy to hear you, and in the name of the Global Department, I really want to thank you, and I hope we will meet for real and not virtually very soon to discuss this issue, because as Eric said, there are a lot of connections between your three papers, so it would be great to pursue the discussion. Thank you very much, all of you, and see you. So as they say, the next session is beginning in 30 minutes, and it's about assimilation theories facing ethnic and racial studies, a very good topics. So I encourage everyone to stay and to stay tuned, as we say. And I say having a good end of the day, and thank you again. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.